I've been a teacher, as my bio said, for 20 plus years. Spent the first half of my career in the classroom. Loved teaching the lower grade levels, grade one, grade twos, grade threes. Those were my funnest years teaching. Uh, for the past part of my career, I've moved more into educational leadership, focusing on Indigenous subject matter. And for For the better part of a decade, I was a land-based learning and curriculum specialist, focusing on bringing traditional and cultural content into classrooms. So, for the past 2 years now, I've been an independent consultant in First Nations and Métis education, really still focusing on bringing cultural and traditional practices into curriculum across Alberta. I do work with all of the educational consortia throughout Alberta, Alberta Professional Learning Consortia, and all of its subsidiary regional consortiums, as well as doing a little bit of work with College of Alberta School Superintendents as an cultural advisor, and mainly helping planning their First Nation Métis conference every year. Uh, I continue to be active in the nations as well, the Métis settlements, as well as assisting and working with Métis Nation through Rupert's Land and assisting them as a Métis knowledge holder, as well as working with a lot of the First Nations in my region throughout Treaty 8 and assisting them with uh, educational, cultural, traditional programming and bringing programming into the communities. So that's just a little bit more about myself. What does that mean? It means I'm a very busy man. So, but one of the things I enjoy is my work with Northern Lakes College as well on the Indigenous Administration Micro Credential program, because it's, of course, I helped develop the program as uh, subject matter expert. I don't like to call myself an expert, but I did assist in that capacity with the program in bringing in my knowledge or knowing where to seek the knowledge. Uh, Another thing is throughout my career and throughout my life, I very much maintained a traditional cultural lifestyle, hunting and gathering, medicinal gathering practices, spiritual practices, ceremonies. I'm a powwow dancer. So I really, really trying to navigate walking in those two worlds, as our elders say, and navigating my professional road that I follow along with my cultural road and trying to bring the two together. So with this will be my second year with Northern Lakes College and the Indigenous Administration Micro Credential Program. And all of the subject matter is near and dear to me because it's stuff that I work with daily and it's stuff that I'm very much passionate about. So, of course, upcoming here on September 30th, we have the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, recognized throughout Canada as as the as the day for remembrance and really I guess the heart of that day when it was developed is really focusing on the whole reconciliation aspect of truth and reconciliation. But we're going to explore the whole concept of truth and reconciliation today just by giving you a walkthrough of the Indigenous Administration Micro Credential course number 6 of that program, because this program does have a module that focuses on truth and reconciliation. So, without further ado, we'll get right into what the course looks like. So I'm going to share my screen. Just give me a minute here. I get confused because I have to navigate between three different platforms of online delivery. So they tend to meld into each other after a while. So hopefully you can see my screen. If not, just put something in the chat saying you can't see my screen. But here we have the welcome page of the Indigenous Administration Micro-Credential course number 6, which is entitled Ceremonies and Protocols. So you'll see on the left of the screen the modules covered in this micro-credential. You'll see module 1 talks about all about elders and elder protocols. Module 2 talks about all about powwows and celebrations. Module 3 goes into ceremonies and gratitude. And then module number 4 is where we're focusing on today, is all about truth and reconciliation. So if we just click on module 4, you'll see how it gives, of course, as always, because there is some very sensitive subject matter, especially for uh, both Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people, but especially those who were survivors of residential school. So we do have a disclaimer there uh, with a crisis support hotline for anyone feeling that they really need somebody to talk to if anything is brought up in the subject matter, because the subject matter is still very much delicate, and it's something that we need to handle delicately because there are some people who are still suffering a great deal of historical trauma and generational trauma. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So all of our micro-credential modules, they go through the same format that you're seeing here with the overview, learning objectives, and the completion instructions. But we really want to focus on the subject matter of what is truth and reconciliation. And I want to start off by showing this video because I think it does really add to the description or trying to get across the concept of what does reconciliation mean.
I was a survivor of the Indian residential school. I was put on a plane at the age of 5 and sent off to Brantford for a whole year. And then I ended up in Letuk residential school for 9 years. And that really separated me from my parents, from my culture, from the land. I had to go back and relearn my language, my culture, my ways. And it does affect the people. It does affect the families, and it takes years, for healing.
For reconciliation to work and for a relationship to be renewed, there must be awareness, acceptance, apology, atonement, and action.
If you notice on the TRC logo, at least what I perceive there is a circle of fire. In the analogy of that fire, ring of fire, you are the fire and I am the fire. And together we make the circle.
We have an extremely distinguished list of guests here today. It is an absolute honor to be in the same room.
Today's Health Talks is about helping us all gain a better understanding of reconciliation and how, as Canadians and public servants, we can live and work in ways that honor its intent.
This, of course, is just one conversation in a dialogue that is underway, a dialogue that I have to say is very, very long overdue. We have an unprecedented opportunity to achieve reconciliation between Canada and First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. Now is the time to challenge previously held beliefs and to invest in strong relationships.
I think today's going to be a very important conversation. I'm really looking forward to the dialogue, to hear how we're going to continue to act on health and ensure that our Indigenous communities are put first.
I'm so excited for this event. First of all, I'm a First Nations public servant, and it means a lot to me to see that the health portfolio is beginning to have these types of talks to discuss reconciliation. It's been a long time coming.
Abel Boson, Grand Chief of the Cree Nation and Chairman of the Cree Regional Government. For me, reconciliation is about resetting the button. For me, it's about looking at the past, acknowledging that we've made mistakes in the past in all the different sectors, and then resetting that button and starting to work together, working on what the new government institutions should be, what the economic development partnership should be. So it's a new approach to, going forward.
My name is Brenda Reynolds, and I'm the former TRC Health Support Liaison. One first girl came forward and spoke her truth about being sexually abused. The constable and I would be interviewing and finding out what had happened. 17 times that happened that one night. 17 girls disclosed. And I was a young social worker.
My name is Cindy Blackstock. I'm a member of the Gitxsan First Nation, and I'm the Executive Director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society. Reconciliation at its center is really about, for me, fundamentally two things. It is about respect, and it is about love.
Natan Obed, I'm the president of Inuit Tapui Kanatami. Reconciliation is a really difficult concept for a lot of Canadians, and it's also a difficult concept for us as Indigenous peoples as well, because reconciliation isn't just about the relationship between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples in this country. It's also between generations of Indigenous peoples. It's between families of Indigenous peoples. There's a lot of things that have happened in the last 100 years that have driven us apart and are things that we need to overcome.
Listening alone is not enough. And I think that we need to take action. And there are different forms of action, individual, professionally, and so forth.
I would love to see political leaders give the public service not only permission, but support and protection for being insubordinate to bad ideas. We need to stop dehumanizing the impacts through either creation of acronyms, files, that type of thing. And we need to recalibrate our relationship so it's out of that savage and civilized dichotomy.
Reconciliation doesn't happen when we're all the same color at the table. It happens when there's different cultures and the diversity within the Indigenous people. As speakers sitting here, we all come from different tribes and different parts of Canada, and that should be reflective when you're looking at developing policies.
This is an ulu. This is an Inuit women's knife. This item is Inuit specific, but is also evidence-based. It's also globally informed. The idea is that you don't question it. This is ours, and we've made it, and it is a symbol of Inuit culture today in 2018. So I want to make a deal with you. That this same principle that you've blindly given me for this, that you can also apply to your work. That when you work with Inuit, you accept that when we come to the table with positions, they're Inuit specific, they're evidence-based, and they're globally informed.
Today we have the capability and we have the leadership, and God help us, we have the money to say to First Nations kids, you are worth the money, you are worth the sacrifice, you're worth us taking down whatever red tape gets in the way of you having a proper childhood. Because we can't say sorry again. I've seen lots of governments come and go, but you all stay around, and if you're able to entrench that spirit of reconciliation by respecting us and falling in love with our kids and making sure that you're really standing up for the public, that reason that you got into the public service in the first place, then a lot of these mistakes from the past won't keep happening. And a lot of kids will grow up to have a healthy and happy childhood. for the first time in the history of this country because of you.
Most important, love and compassion.
To remember as a public servant that reconciliation just isn't about the legal piece and the briefing notes, but it's also about putting a human lens on things.
To me, I guess the message that I learned today, we all have a role to play when it comes to reconciliation. Our employees are the ones that prepare briefs and provide us with information, and it's important they provide us with that proper information and also play that challenging function role that I think is really important to empower our public service to be able to do that.
Part of this is this new partnership and trying to figure out how to speak the same language and what we're all trying to achieve together.
All right, so that movie, that video snippet tried to explain a little bit about reconciliation and what reconciliation is. And the question that this module asks uh, participants is, what does reconciliation mean to you? But before we go on to that, I want you to think about that question for a little, and I'm just going to give you a bit more information to help you form an answer. Because of course, a big part of truth and reconciliation is, of course, the truth. And I know there's just following social media right now, there's been a real resurgence of what we call denialists coming forward who are denying that that anything happened within the residential school system or anything really happened to Indigenous peoples in Canada. And we're seeing more and more of them coming out, mainly in social media, of course, and it's very troubling and disturbing to have these denialists coming out, especially as an Indigenous person. Uh, Both my parents were residential school survivors, and hearing their personal accounts, their personal eyewitness stories of some of the things that occurred, uh, it saddens me when people step forward and have the denialist claims that nothing happened and why are we bringing this up? It happened years ago and it's way back in history. So just a few numbers regarding that especially the denialists that say it happened generations ago. Why are we still talking about it? Well, the last residential school closed in 1998, which isn't all that long ago. Now, in terms of truth with Indian residential schools, uh, it was only in 2008 when the Canadian government gave their official apology for Indian residential schools. And it was an admission that, yes, these things did happen and an acknowledgement that these things did occur and that we're still suffering and living with that historical trauma today. It was only in 2022 when Pope Francis gave his official apology for Indian residential schools to Indigenous people in Canada. So this is 2022 when the church is finally acknowledging that yes, these things did happen. Just this past month, the College of Canadian Surgeons gave an official apology for uh, the things that happened to Indigenous people during the Indian residential school era. So these are things that are occurring today, now, especially in terms of historical trauma. We still have a great deal of Indian residential school survivors who are alive and still telling their story, some who are still haven't reached that point. So in terms of reconciliation, I think we're still working through the whole truth part and on our way toward reconciliation. So I'll share my screen again, and we're just going to scroll to the bottom of the, it gives a brief description of the reconciliation, but you'll see a big part of that reconciliation again is acknowledging. So if we still have a number of people, the denialists who are still not acknowledging, we've still got some work to do towards reconciliation. But I'd like to ask that question to you and what you think uh, reconciliation means to you. So what does reconciliation mean to you? I'll tell you what reconciliation means to me. As soon as I could find my other screen again. Reconciliation to me is, again, the big part of reconciliation is acknowledging and understanding the past wrongs. And in order to reconcile, it's both parties, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, who must work through that healing together. Because it's not just Indigenous people who suffered the wrongs, because there's a lot of Indigenous people who grew up in our Indigenous communities and lived alongside Indigenous peoples throughout their lives, and they bore witness to discrimination, to inequities throughout society, and inequities in education, inequities in healthcare. They watch their friends go through this. So there's definitely going to be a great deal of healing for those non-Indigenous peoples as well to have to have witnessed that and felt powerless to do anything. That is definitely a form of historical trauma as well that they're going to have to work through. But reconciliation means working through that together by first uh, telling the truth about it, acknowledging it, telling the story, and then working together to move forward in a good way together and building a society where those inequities don't exist and those um, that racism doesn't exist and working in collaboration and cooperation. So the next section within the micro credential goes right into the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and talks about what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is, the history of where the commission came from, but more importantly, it talks about the 94 calls to action that came from the TRC, and the commission's mandate was to try and look at initiatives to work towards truth and reconciliation, especially the reconciliation part. And within the micro-credential, it gives you information, of course, about what is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, their funding, the history, uh, who is part of the Reconciliation Commission. But for anyone wanting to learn more about the TRC, they do have a website, and that is the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. You can see the web address at the top, https://nctr.ca. And it gives you all the information and all the resources about the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. And more so where we stand right now with those uh, 94 calls to action, because unfortunately, uh, from that Truth and Reconciliation Commission, they give you the entirety of the TRC documents as well as the calls to action, and it's quite extensive. So we're not going to go through all of the 94 calls. Uh, But if you do get a chance, go to the website and you can download the copy of the 94 calls to actions. Now, where do they stand so far with those calls to action? Or right now to date, there has been some progress made on some of the calls to action. However, not one single one of those 94 calls to action has been acted upon or put into practice or policy from the Canadian government. They are still in the process of acting on those calls to action and bringing them forward. However, some of the calls to action, there has been some partial movement on them, however, not full movement toward that. An example of this was last February when the Canadian government did hand over the rights to child welfare to First Nation. I know I work a great deal with a lot of numerous elders and knowledge keepers, and they tell me their stories. However, I don't feel comfortable sharing their stories. I'd rather have them share their stories, but I can't share my stories, having grown up as uh, that whole generational trauma as a child of survivors of residential school. So with myself, what I've experienced was very much seeing my parents struggle with that whole lack of parenting skills. Because, of course, they never got to witness. We learn as Indigenous people, and I think as human beings, we learn by observing. So when they were very young, they didn't have that nurturing environment where they could observe mothering behavior, parenting behavior, fathering behavior. They did not have that experience where they could observe and see that whole interaction between a mother and a father with their child. So they very much lack those skills, not only to be affectionate to the children, but in raising a child, they didn't get to observe that or see it uh, occur as they were growing up. They were in that residential school and they were given their number, not a name, and they had no identity and they were not allowed to speak their language and going through the punishments and all of that. But that affection was lacking. So very not very surprising that they had a great deal of difficulty in showing affection to their children because it's something they didn't observe. And I never once blamed them for that or had any ill feelings to them. I still feel sad about it because I know why. Uh, as I was growing up as a child, of course, I was resentful of it and I was resentful of them. But later on in life, I started to learn why all about the residential school and what they experienced and started to see those behaviors coming out in them. And that's when I really started feeling sad for them and and still to this day feeling sad for them because their childhood was robbed from them. Their first line in education uh, especially in terms of parenting, was taken from them. They did not have that experience to go by when they had children. So it's not surprising uh, that they had trouble parenting and had trouble navigating that and and even knowing how the basic fundamentals that we have as parents, how we should be raising children and things we should be doing with children, especially affection. Now, one of my aunts also she spent the longest in residential school. She's now 76 years old, still a survivor, a residential school. But the thing about her, it was only 2 years ago when she was 74, for the first time in her life when I had visited her, when I was leaving, she asked me for a hug. And I was shocked because growing up with her, she was always very stern, never showed her emotions, was very strict and uh, ensured uh, focused on that whole I guess uh, fear fear of punishment to get the behavior she wanted to see. So we were always afraid of her because we saw her as really mean, really cold, never showed any affection to her children, my cousins, or us. And we were pretty close. But it was only 2 years ago when she was 74 and I was leaving, and she asked me for a hug. And when I hugged her, she cried and she said, I finally learned how to hug. 74 years old, that late in her life to finally be able to show affection and to show something as simple as a physical hug. I was so touched by that, but more so, I was very saddened that she had to go through almost her entire life to to come to the later part of her life and to have to navigate that on her own just to learn how to hug. And this was just because of what she suffered in residential school. So when people talk about uh, denialist claims, nothing happened, oh, it's all made up, oh, this is just being done for money, uh, it not only hurts me as an Indigenous person, but it angers me because having lived through that, it's troubling, it's angering, it's frustrating. And at the same time, as an educator, it really shows me we've got some work to do. We've got a long way to go, uh, still working through that truth. Because if we have a lot of people not acknowledging, we still need to reach that point of acknowledgement before we can move forward with reconciliation. So we've definitely got a ways to go. So I'm going to share my screen again and go back to the micro credential course. You'll see here again, that was all about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I'd urge you to look at those calls to action because some of them are really interesting to go through. Uh, Section 3 talks about specifically about the calls to action, and there's a summary about exactly what the calls were and the more significant calls to action. As educators, as people who work within education, one of the more outstanding call to action that actually wasn't acted upon until uh, not too recently was the call to repeal Section 43 of the Criminal Code of Canada. And for those that don't know what Section 43 was, uh, it was the law that says educators and parents had the right to uh, what is it? Punish their children physically for wrongdoings. So that law was still in force until not too recently. So it was those are the types of calls to action that came out of there, and that was mainly because as our uh, our Indigenous communities were seeing that specific criminal code offense, sorry, uh, that specific code being used in schools where a lot of our children were being wrongfully punished physically, and it was legal by law. Uh, so it's repealing sections such as that So now with alongside the TRC and the calls to action, we had the initiation of UNDRIP, or the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Now, with UNDRIP, through the United Nations, all of the nations agreed to enact 46 articles under UNDRIP, all about the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And just to be clear, again, was enacted and received royal assent in Canada on July of or June of 2022. So it is enacted in Canada legally. So these are the rights, and we're not going to go through all 46 of them, or all 46 articles, but it very much speaks to the rights of Indigenous people, not just in Canada, but around the world. And the United Nations has been very clear on the timeline when these have to be implemented. Now, the implementation date uh, for the articles under UNDRIP for Canada was for 2023 was implementation year. So of course we're at 2024 now, and I haven't seen any updates on how many of these articles have been enacted or implemented in Canada, but there are 46 articles that were agreed upon by all of the nations in the United Nations to be implemented. A very interesting read if you go through and read through all the articles that guarantee the rights of Indigenous people. Again, on the implementation, here we go again, June 2021. 2021, the UN Declaration received royal assent and became law. So December 2021, December 22, phase 2 will run March 2023 and May 2023. So these are the implementation dates. This is the most current from the government website. So doesn't really say where we stand now. This was March of 2023. So there hasn't been an update as of yet to where we stand on those implementation of those articles under UNDRIP. So I'm going to stop sharing there. The rest of the Indigenous Administration micro-credential number 6 really goes into Orange Shirt Day and September 30th. However, that'll be the topic of my discussion on Thursday. So we're just going to leave it at that today.